The old dog shouldn't have even been alive, let alone walking, but Duke had never been good at understanding limitations. 20 years of hard frontier living had left him nearly blind, his muzzle gray as winter frost, his joints so arthritic that every step looked painful. But when the shooting started at the Silver Point Bank that Tuesday morning, Duke lifted his scarred head and moved toward the sound with purpose that surprised everyone who'd assumed he was just waiting to die. Inside that bank, tied to a chair with a gun to his head, sat Henry Dawson, the man who'd raised Duke from a pup and then vanished without explanation 2 decades ago, leaving behind a confused young dog who'd spent years waiting for a return that never came. If you want to discover how this impossible recognition changed everything, how one moment of pure love stopped violence in its tracks, subscribe now and join us for stories that prove the bonds we form never truly break. Silver Point had been a quiet town that morning, the kind of peaceful that made people forget they lived on the edge of lawless territory, where fortunes changed faster than weather. Henry Dawson had arrived on the previous day's stage, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and the cautious movements of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. He'd come to Silver Point on banking business, transferring funds to a ranch he managed in northern Colorado, routine work that should have been completed in an hour and forgotten by afternoon. Instead, he'd walked into the Silver Point Bank at exactly the wrong moment, just as Vincent Crowe and 4 armed men entered to the back door with bandanas covering their faces and murder in their eyes. Vincent Crowe was a name spoken in whispers across 3 territories, a former Confederate officer who'd never accepted the war's end, and had spent 25 years taking his anger out on a world he believed had betrayed him. His gang specialized in bank robberies executed with military precision, and they'd successfully hit 7 banks in 18 months without losing a man or facing serious pursuit. Crowe's reputation for ruthless efficiency was matched only by his reputation for killing anyone who resisted, and the 4 bodies he left across Wyoming and Montana served as warnings that cooperation was survival and heroism was suicide. When he walked into Silver Point Bank that morning, everyone inside understood immediately that their lives depended on absolute obedience and pure luck. The bank manager, a nervous man named Peter Hollis, had tried to comply quickly, opening the vault without argument and directing his 2 clerks to cooperate fully. But one of the customers, a young miner named Samuel who just struck a modest claim and was depositing his first real earnings, had made a mistake of reaching for something in his coat. Crowe's enforcer, a cold-eyed killer named Frank Moss, had shot Samuel without hesitation, the bullet catching him in the shoulder and dropping him screaming to the floor. The message was clear. Any movement, any resistance, any hint of noncompliance would be met with immediate violence. Henry had frozen in place like everyone else, hands visible, eyes down, doing everything right to stay alive in a situation where right often wasn't enough. They'd been forced to the floor while Crowe's men emptied the vault, taking not just cash, but also the safety deposit boxes that held the private valuables of Silver Point's wealthier citizens. The robbery should have taken 10 minutes, but someone outside had noticed the locked doors and unusual activity, and by the time Crowe's gang was ready to leave, a crowd had gathered. The town sheriff, an aging lawman named Douglas Reed, had positioned himself outside with a rifle and 4 deputized citizens, creating a standoff that transformed a simple robbery into a hostage situation that could end in massacre. Crowe had made quick calculations and decided his best option was negotiation from a position of strength. He'd ordered his men to tie up 6 hostages, selecting them for maximum leverage. Henry as an outsider with money, Peter Hollis as the bank manager, Samuel the wounded miner, 2 female clerks named Mary and Elizabeth, and a teenage boy named Thomas who'd been making a deposit for his father's general store. They were bound to chairs in full view of the front windows, human shields that made any assault by the sheriff suicide for the innocents. Crowe had then sent one of his men, a wiry criminal named Jake Porter, to negotiate, demanding horses, supplies, and a 12-hour head start in exchange for releasing the hostages unharmed. Sheriff Reed had been in law enforcement for 30 years and knew that negotiating with men like Crowe rarely ended well. But he also knew that a frontal assault would guarantee the deaths of civilians he'd sworn to protect. He'd sent for help from the nearest cavalry post, 40 miles away, knowing that reinforcements wouldn't arrive for hours and that Crowe's patience would run out long before then. The standoff had stretched into its second hour when Duke appeared, the old dog moving slowly down Silver Point's main street with a deliberate pace of age and infirmity. seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Duke had belonged to the town in a way old dogs sometimes did. No specific owner, but fed by various families who recognized him as a fixture of Silver Point's character. He'd arrived 5 years ago, already old, already carrying the marks of a hard life. The local veterinarian, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, had examined him out of curiosity and determined he was at least 15 years old, possibly older, with healed injuries that suggested either abuse or an extremely rough existence. She'd offered to put him down humanely, but Duke had seemed content despite his condition, and the townspeople had collectively decided to let him live out whatever time remained on his own terms. No one knew Duke's history before Silver Point, where he'd come from, or what kind of life he'd lived before becoming the town's unofficial mascot. But Dr. Chin had noted that Duke responded complex commands in a language that wasn't quite English and wasn't quite anything else she recognized, suggesting professional training from someone who understood dogs deeply. Duke's behavior supported this theory. Despite his age and blindness, he moved through Silver Point with confidence, never getting lost, always knowing where he was going even when his eyes couldn't show him the way. He had a dignity about him that transcended his circumstances, the bearing of a dog who'd once been important to someone and hadn't forgotten what that felt like. That morning, Duke had been sleeping in his usual spot behind the general store when the gunshot inside the bank had woken him. Most dogs would have fled from the sound of violence, but Duke had instead moved toward it, his nose working overtime to process the complex scent information his failing eyes couldn't provide. He'd navigated a crowded street where townspeople were hiding behind barrels and posts, watching the bank with terrified fascination. And no one had thought to stop an old dog from walking into what might become a killing ground. Duke pushed through the bank's partially open door and stood in the entrance, his head swaying slightly as he tried to orient himself in the unfamiliar space. Crow's men had noticed him immediately, and Frank Moss had raised his pistol to shoot the animal, viewing it as a potential distraction or threat. But Crow had stopped him with a raised hand, curious about why an obviously ancient and harmless dog would walk into a bank robbery. There was something almost surreal about the moment. This decrepit animal standing in a doorway while armed men held hostages at gunpoint, as if two different realities had collided and neither knew quite how to proceed. Duke's nose lifted, testing the air, processing sense that his brain cataloged and compared against memories stored for 2 decades. His body went rigid in a way that made everyone in the bank pause, recognizing that whatever was happening inside the dog's mind was significant. Then Duke moved, not with a slow shuffle of old age, but with sudden purpose, crossing the floor directly toward the hostages tied to their chairs. Frank Moss stepped forward to intercept him, but something in Duke's intensity made him hesitate, and the dog passed within inches of armed outlaws who could have killed him but chose not to, responding to something primal in Duke's behavior that demanded witness rather than intervention. Duke stopped in front of Henry Dawson's chair, his clouded eyes unable to see the man's face, but his nose confirming what his memory insisted was impossible. The dog's entire body began to shake, not with fear or age, but with overwhelming emotion, and he made a sound that was part whine and part cry, a vocalization of recognition, and joy and grief that cut through the tension in the room. Henry, who'd been sitting with his head down and eyes closed, opened them at the sound and looked directly at the old dog trembling in front of him. For a moment, his face showed nothing but confusion, unable to process why this animal was here or what it wanted. Then recognition hit Henry like a physical blow, his eyes going wide with shock and disbelief. His mouth formed a word that came out as barely a whisper. "Duke?" The dog's response was immediate and unmistakable, his tail beginning to wag with energy that seemed impossible for his ancient body, his whole being radiating a joy so pure and complete that everyone in the bank felt it like heat from a fire. Henry's face transformed, years of carefully maintained control shattering as tears began streaming down his cheeks, and he leaned forward as far as the bonds allowed, desperately trying to close the distance between himself and the dog who'd somehow, impossibly, found him after 20 years of separation. Vincent Crow watched a reunion unfold with an expression that moved from irritation to confusion to something he couldn't quite name. He'd spent 25 years cultivating an immunity to human emotion, training himself to see people as obstacles or assets rather than individuals with stories and connections. But there was something about the old dog pressing against the bound man's legs, about the tears running down Henry's face, about the pure recognition passing between them, that penetrated defenses Crow didn't even know he still possessed. He raised his hand to stop Frank Moss from interfering, a decision made without conscious thought, driven by curiosity about what he was witnessing and an uncomfortable feeling that killing this moment would somehow diminish him in ways robbery and hostage-taking had not. Henry was speaking now, his voice broken and raw, telling Duke he was sorry, so sorry, asking forgiveness in words that tumbled out between sobs. The other hostages stared in confusion, unable to understand why their fellow captive was having an emotional breakdown over a stray dog in the middle of a bank robbery. But Vincent Crow understood, or was beginning to, because he'd owned a dog once, a lifetime ago before the war had turned him into something unrecognizable. He'd had a hound named Jackson who'd followed him through 3 years of Confederate service, who died taking a Yankee bullet meant for Crow himself. He'd sworn never to feel anything like that again, never to give any creature the power to hurt him through its loss. Mary, one of the bound clerks, found her voice and asked quietly what was happening, who the dog was, why this mattered when they were all likely to die in the next few hours. Henry didn't answer immediately, his attention entirely focused on Duke, his hand straining against the ropes that prevented him from touching the animal he'd thought was long dead. Finally, he spoke, his words directed at Duke, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He said Duke had been his dog 20 years ago, that circumstances he couldn't control had forced Henry to leave, that he'd entrusted Duke to his brother with instructions to care for him and promises that Henry would return when he could. The story came out in fragments, interrupted by emotion, and Duke's continued attempts to press closer despite his arthritic joints making movement painful. Henry explained he'd been a rancher in eastern Wyoming, married with a young daughter, building a life that seemed secure until drought and debt had destroyed everything. When the bank had foreclosed on his property, Henry had made a choice born of desperation. He'd taken money that wasn't his, funds he was transporting for his employer, and disappeared rather than face prison and leave his family destitute. He'd sent most of the money back anonymously over the years, working under assumed names and paying his debt through a decade of self-imposed exile and grinding labor that aged and beyond his years. His wife had died while he was gone, his daughter raised by relatives who'd been told Henry was dead, and his brother had promised to keep Duke until Henry could safely return and reclaim both his identity and his dog. But when Henry had finally earned enough and repaid enough to come home, he'd found his brother's ranch abandoned, the property sold, and no trace of Duke or knowledge of where he'd gone. Henry had assumed Duke was dead, that his brother had either kept the dog until natural death claimed him or sold him, or simply let him go when maintaining him became inconvenient. The guilt of that assumption had lived in Henry for the past 5 years, one more weight added to the burden of choices made and prices paid. Duke had no way to tell his side of the story, but his presence and conditions spoke volumes. Somehow, he'd survived Henry's brother's abandonment or death, had traveled unknown distances, had endured hardships that should have killed an animal his age a dozen times over. The fact that he'd ended up in Silver Point, in the same town where Henry happened to be conducting business on the same day a robbery trapped them both in the same room, defied statistical probability, and entered the realm of something that rational people struggled to explain. Vincent Crow was not a superstitious man, but even he felt the weight of impossible coincidence pressing down on the moment, making it significant in ways that transcended the practical concerns of robbery and escape. Frank Moss, less philosophical than his boss, pointed out that they were wasting time, that the sheriff outside was probably organizing reinforcements, that standing around watching a man cry over a dog was tactically stupid. Crow turned on him with sudden fury, his hand dropping to his pistol in a movement that froze Frank in place. Crow said they'd leave where he decided they'd leave, that Frank would keep his mouth shut unless he wanted to find out if he was more valuable as a gang member than as an object lesson. The violence in Crow's voice made everyone in the bank tense, but also revealed something. The reunion between Henry and Duke had affected Crow deeply enough that he was willing to defend it with lethal force against his own men. Jake Porter, who'd been watching the street through a window, reported that the sheriff was holding position, but that a crowd had gathered and people were getting agitated. Someone had ridden out, probably to get help from neighboring towns or the cavalry. Crow acknowledged this information with a nod, but made no move to accelerate their timeline. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone. He pulled out his knife, walked over to Henry, and cut the ropes binding his hands. Henry's arms came free, and without hesitation, he dropped his knees beside Duke, wrapping the old dog in an embrace that was as much pain as joy, 20 years of guilt and loss pouring out in a moment that had no room for pride or dignity or awareness of watching eyes. Duke pressed into Henry with the full weight of his aged body, making sounds that were almost human in their expressiveness, his tail wagging so hard his entire back half moved with emotion. Henry was whispering into Duke's ear, words that no one else could hear, but everyone could feel the weight of apologies and love and promises that this time he wouldn't leave, that Duke had found him and they'd stay found no matter what happened next. Peter Hollis, the bank manager, watched this with tears in his own eyes, thinking about a dog he'd lost as a child and never properly mourned. Elizabeth, the younger clerk, was crying openly, her fear temporarily forgotten in the face of something so genuinely beautiful it transcended their circumstances. Vincent Crowe stood back, his face a mask but his eyes revealing turmoil. He'd built a life around taking what he wanted and destroying what stood in his way, around viewing the world as a battlefield where only the ruthless survived. But this moment challenged that worldview in ways he couldn't articulate, showing that some things endure despite being lost, that some bonds survive time and separation and probability. He thought about Jackson, about the hound's last moments bleeding out in Virginia mud, about how Crowe had held him and promised revenge against a world that killed good things indiscriminately. He'd kept that promise by becoming a killer himself. But standing here watching Henry and Duke, he wondered if revenge was just another form of running away from grief. Thomas, the teenage hostage, broke the silence with a question directed at Crowe. What happened now? The question hung in the air, practical and urgent, demanding acknowledgement that this moment, however profound, existed within a larger context of violence and law and consequences. Crowe considered the question longer than it deserved, his mind working through options and implications. He could execute his original plan, use the hostages to secure safe passage, kill anyone who pursued them, and disappear into the territories where law was more suggestion than enforcement. Or he could do something different, something his younger self might have considered before the war taught him that mercy was weakness and compassion was liability. Outside, Sheriff Reed was indeed organizing, but not in the way Jake Porter feared. Reed had been watching through binoculars from across the street, had seen the old dog enter the bank, had witnessed the window of the moment between Henry and Duke. He was a pragmatic man who'd survived 30 years of law enforcement by understanding human nature, and what he'd seen told him something fundamental had shifted inside that bank. He couldn't explain how he knew this, but he trusted his instincts the way he trusted them through countless dangerous situations. He ordered his deputies to hold fire and sent a messenger to intercept the cavalry unit he'd requested, telling them to approach cautiously rather than with aggression. Inside the bank, Duke had settled against Henry's chest, his breathing labored but peaceful, his mission completed. The old dog had spent 5 years surviving for no clear reason, his body deteriorating, but his spirit maintaining just enough vitality to keep going. Now, pressed against a human who'd been his entire world 2 decades ago, Duke's purpose was fulfilled and his exhaustion became impossible to deny. Henry felt the shift in Duke's body, the way his muscles relaxed beyond simple rest into something deeper, and panic replaced joy. He called Duke's name urgently, patting the dog's face, trying to keep him present and conscious. Dr. Sarah Chun, watching from outside to the bank windows, recognized the signs immediately. She stepped into the street despite the danger, calling out to Sheriff Reed that the dog was dying, that whatever was happening needed to happen quickly if Henry was going to have more than these few minutes with the animal he'd lost. Reed made an instant decision, calling out to the bank that he was sending in the town doctor, that she was unarmed and coming to help the dog, that if Crowe had any humanity, he'd allow it. The request was unprecedented. Negotiating medical care for an animal during a hostage standoff, but Reed was operating on instinct rather than protocol. Vincent Crowe heard the sheriff's call and laughed, a sound without humor that filled the bank with bitter resonance. He called back that the sheriff was insane, that they were negotiating human lives here, and a dying dog changed nothing. But even as he said it, his eyes were on Duke and Henry, on the desperation in the bound man's face as he watched his dog slipping away. Frank Moss said they should shoot the dog, that it was dying anyway, and putting it down would simplify everything. The words were barely out of his mouth when Crowe's pistol was pressed against Frank's temple. Crow's voice deadly quiet as he told Frank that the next person who suggested harming the dog would be dead before the suggestion was complete. The doctor entered slowly, her medical bag visible, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. Crow's men trained their guns on her but didn't fire, waiting for orders that didn't come because Crow was paralyzed by indecision and memories of his own dog dying in his arms. Dr. Chun knelt beside Henry and Duke, examining the old dog with efficient competence. She told Henry quietly that Duke's heart was failing, that his body had held on far longer than should have been possible, that finding Henry had probably been the only thing keeping him alive. Now that mission was complete, Duke's body was shutting down, and there was nothing medicine could do except manage his comfort in these final moments. Henry's face crumbled, the brief joy of reunion destroyed by the cruelty of having it last only minutes. He asked if there was any way to extend the time, any treatment that could give them days, or even hours instead of minutes. Dr. Chin shook her head sadly, explaining that Duke's organs were failing systemically, that his time was measured in moments now, and that the kindest thing was to let him go peacefully in Henry's arms rather than prolonging suffering for human comfort. She offered morphine to ease any pain, and Henry accepted with a nod, his hand never stopping its gentle stroking of Duke's graying muzzle as the doctor administered the injection. The morphine worked quickly, and Duke's breathing eased into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Henry pressed his forehead against the old dog's head, whispering things that were meant only for Duke's failing ears, a lifetime of conversation compressed into moments. The bank had gone silent. Even the Outlaws watched with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly emotional. Mary was crying quietly, and Peter Hollis had stopped trying to hide his tears. Even Jake Porter, who'd killed 3 men in the past year without remorse, found himself looking away from the scene, unable to witness something so intimate and painful without feeling things he'd spent years trying to bury. Vincent Crow holstered his pistol and walked to the window, staring out at Sheriff Reed and the gathered townspeople. His mind was moving through memories he'd locked away decades ago, images of Jackson running through fields before the war, sleeping beside his bedroll on cold nights, looking at him with trust that Crow had believed he'd never betray. He remembered the moment Jackson had died, remembered the promise he'd made to make the world pay for taking something good and leaving him with nothing but rage. 25 years he'd kept that promise, and what did he have to show for it? Money he couldn't spend safely, a reputation that isolated him, men who followed him from fear rather than loyalty, and nights when he woke from dreams of the dog he'd loved and lost. Behind him, Duke's breathing changed, becoming shallower and more irregular. Dr. Chin checked his pulse and looked at Henry with an expression that needed no words. Henry nodded understanding and pulled Duke closer, his voice breaking as he told the dog he was a good boy, the best boy, that he'd never stopped loving him, that he was sorry for everything. Duke's tail moved once more, a weak flutter that took the last of his strength, and his eyes, clouded and nearly blind, fixed on Henry's face with recognition that transcended physical sight. Then Duke's breathing stopped, the light fading from his eyes as his body went completely still in Henry's arms. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Henry's ragged breathing as he held Duke's body and rocked slowly back and forth. No one moved or spoke, the moment demanding respect even from men who'd lost the right to claim decency. Vincent Crow felt something crack inside his chest, a pain so sharp it almost dropped him to his knees. He'd watched men die, without feeling a fraction of what he felt now, watching the stranger grieve a dog who'd loved him enough to spend 20 years surviving just to see him one more time. The cruelty of that reunion, lasting only minutes before death, claimed Duke anyway, seemed cosmically unjust in ways that Crow's rational mind couldn't dismiss. Frank Moss made a mistake of saying they needed to get moving, that the dog was dead, and they'd wasted enough time on sentiment. Vincent Crow turned from the window, and in 2 steps had crossed the room, his fist connecting with Frank's jaw hard enough to drop him to the floor. Crow stood over him, breathing hard, his hands shaking with rage or grief or something he couldn't name. He told Frank that when they left this bank, Frank wouldn't be coming with them, that any man callous enough to dismiss what they just witnessed had no place in Crow's gang. Frank started to protest, but Jake Porter grabbed his arm and pulled him away, recognizing that arguing would likely end with Frank dead on the floor. Sheriff Reed's voice called from outside, asking if everyone was all right, if the doctor was safe, if they could come to some arrangement. Crow looked at Henry, still holding Duke's body, and made a decision that 25 years of being an outlaw should have made impossible. He walked to Henry and cut the remaining hostages' bonds, freeing all 6 of them with quick, efficient movements. He told them they could leave, that the robbery was over, that he'd wasted enough of everyone's time. Peter Hollis stared in disbelief, unable to process that they were being released. Elizabeth and Mary moved immediately toward the door, not questioning their good fortune. Thomas helped the wounded Samuel to his feet, supporting him as they shuffled toward freedom. Henry didn't move, didn't even seem to register that he'd been freed. His entire focus remained on Duke, on memorizing the weight of the dog's body, the texture of his fur, the reality of having held him one more time. Dr. Chin put a gentle hand on Henry's shoulder and told him she'd help him bury Duke properly, that they'd find a good spot where Henry could visit whenever he needed to. Henry nodded, but still didn't release his grip, as if letting go of Duke's body would mean losing him all over again. Crow watched this and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the desire to make something right instead of wrong, to build instead of destroy, to choose mercy when cruelty would have been easier. He told Henry to take the dog and go, that no one would stop him. Henry finally looked up, meeting Crow's eyes, and for a moment, the 2 men existed in a space beyond outlaw and victim, beyond criminal and innocent. They were just 2 men who'd loved dogs, who'd lost them, who understood that some grief never really ended. It just became something you carried. Henry stood slowly, cradling Duke's body with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. He walked toward the door, and the remaining outlaws parted to let him pass, none of them willing to interfere with something that felt sacred despite happening in the middle of a crime scene. Outside, the crowd watched in stunned silence as Henry emerged carrying the dead dog, tears streaming down his face openly now that he was no longer performing strength for his captors. Sheriff Reed moved forward to help, but Henry shook his head, needing to carry this burden himself. Dr. Chin followed him out, and together they walked toward her veterinary office, where she had space for Henry to wash Duke's body and prepare him for burial. The crowd parted like water, everyone recognizing that they were witnessing something significant even if they didn't understand all the details. Inside the bank, Vincent Crow stood alone with his remaining men. Jake Porter asked what happened now, what the plan was, how they were going to escape when they just released their leverage. Crow didn't answer immediately, his mind working through the implications of what he'd done. By any rational calculation, he'd made a catastrophic error. Freeing hostages without securing safe passage meant they were trapped with no bargaining power, facing arrest or death with nothing gained from the robbery they'd executed perfectly until an old dog had walked through the door and changed everything. But Crow found he didn't care about rational calculations anymore, didn't care about the money still sitting in bags on the floor, didn't care about escape routes or future robberies. He was tired, bone-deep tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He'd been running from Jackson's death for 25 years, running from the memory of holding his dying dog and feeling powerless to save him, running from the guilt of surviving a war that took so many good things, including the hound who trusted him completely. Watching Henry and Duke had shown him that running never worked, that grief followed you no matter how fast or far you traveled, that the only escape from pain was through it rather than around it. He told Jake and the others they could take the money and run if they wanted, that he was done, that whatever happened next would happen without his leadership or participation. Jake stared at him in disbelief, asking if Crow had lost his mind over a dog, if 25 years of successful outlawry was being thrown away because an old animal had recognized someone. Crow smiled without humor and said maybe that's exactly what was happening, that maybe the old dog had shown him something he'd been too blind to see, that loyalty and love were worth more than all the money they'd ever stolen, and that die with those things intact was better than living without them. Sheriff Reed entered the bank cautiously, his rifle ready but not aimed, his posture suggesting negotiation rather than assault. He'd been watching Crow through the window, had seen the outlaw's face during the reunion and the death, had recognized the signs of a man reaching the end of his rope. Reed had dealt with enough criminals to know that the dangerous ones were the ones with nothing to lose. But Crow didn't look dangerous anymore. He looked defeated, which was somehow sadder and more human than Reed had expected from a man with Crow's reputation. Reed asked if they were surrendering, if this was over, if anyone else needed to die today. Vincent Crow looked at the sheriff and saw in him something familiar, Another old man who'd spent too many years doing a hard job that aged and beyond his calendar years. Another survivor carrying regrets that outnumbered his successes. He told Reed they were done, that his men could decide for themselves what to do, but that Crow was surrendering. Jake Porter made a disgusted sound and grabbed one of the money bags, signaling to the other two gang members to follow him. They ran for the back door, choosing flight over fight, abandoning Crow without hesitation now that his usefulness was finished. Reed let them go, recognizing that chasing them would mean leaving Crow unguarded and possibly reigniting violence that had been defused. Crow unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the floor, the gesture carrying weight beyond its simple mechanics. He was disarming himself of more than weapons, shedding an identity he'd worn for so long it had fused with his skin. Reed approached carefully and placed Crow in handcuffs, reading him charges in a voice that was professional but not unkind. Crow barely listened, his mind still on Duke and Henry, on the impossible reunion that had lasted minutes, but somehow contained more meaning than 25 years of Crow's choices. He asked Reed if the dog would be buried properly, if Henry would be allowed to do that before legal proceedings complicated everything. Reed nodded and said he'd make sure of it, that some things mattered more than paperwork and protocol. He led Crow out of the bank into afternoon sunshine that seemed too bright for the darkness of what had almost happened. The crowd had dispersed somewhat. People returned to their lives now that immediate danger had passed. But enough remained to witness Vincent Crow, the legendary outlaw, being walked to jail without resistance, his face carrying an expression of peace that seemed incompatible with his reputation. News of what had happened inside the bank was already spreading, the story of the old dog and the reunion morphing as it passed from person to person. Henry buried Duke on a hill overlooking Silver Point as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed fitting for a final goodbye. Dr. Chun had helped him prepare Duke's body, wrapping him in a clean blanket and providing a sturdy wooden box that Henry had lined with straw. Sheriff Reed had granted permission for the burial before any legal proceedings began, understanding that some debts transcended law. Nearly 50 townspeople attended, including Peter Hollis and the other former hostages, all of them drawn by a story that spread through Silver Point like wildfire, growing more remarkable with each telling. Henry spoke over the grave, his voice steady now that shock had given way to acceptance. He told the assembled crowd about the dog Duke had been 20 years ago, about his intelligence and loyalty, about how he'd learned to herd cattle and protect the ranch better than most hired hands. He spoke about the day he'd left, about entrusting Duke to his brother with promises he believed at the time he could keep. He talked about the guilt he'd carried, about assuming Duke had lived a comfortable life and died peacefully, about how learning the truth today had been both devastating and somehow redemptive, because at least they'd had those final minutes together. What Henry didn't say, but what everyone understood, was that Duke's journey to find him had been impossible by any reasonable measure. An old dog, nearly blind, crossing unknown territory to end up in the exact town where Henry happened to be on the exact day he'd be trapped in a bank robbery was coincidence stacked on coincidence until it stopped being coincidence and became something else. Some in the crowd whispered about divine intervention, others about animal instinct transcending known science, but most just accepted that they'd witnessed something rare and precious that defied explanation and didn't require it. As Henry shoveled dirt over Duke's grave, Dr. Chin told the crowd about the condition Duke had been in when he'd arrived in Silver Point 5 years ago. She described injuries consistent with surviving the wild, heel breaks that had set him properly, scars from predator encounters, and malnutrition that should have killed him multiple times over. She said Duke's survival had defied veterinary science, that his body had been failing for years, but as what kept him going long past what should have been possible. Now, having found Henry and completed his mission, Duke had finally been able to let go and rest. The funeral concluded as darkness fell, townspeople offering condolences to Henry before returning to their homes. Peter Hollis approached and told Henry quietly that he'd spoken with the bank's owners, that given the circumstances and Henry's 20-year effort to repay what he'd taken, they were willing to consider the debt settled and wouldn't press charges. It was a mercy Henry hadn't expected and didn't feel he deserved, but he accepted it with gratitude that was silent but profound. Elizabeth, the younger clerk, gave Henry a drawing she'd made during the standoff of Duke pressing against his legs, a moment captured in simple lines that somehow conveyed everything important about what had happened. Sheriff Reed appeared as the last of the mourners left, telling Henry he'd need to provide a full statement about the robbery and his history, but that it could wait until morning. He also mentioned that Vincent Crowe had asked to speak with Henry, that the outlaw was being held in the town jail, and that Reed would arrange a meeting if Henry was willing. Henry considered this request for a long moment before nodding acceptance, curious about what Crowe could possibly want to say and feeling he owed the man something for the mercy he'd shown during Duke's final moments. The jail was a modest building on Silver Point's north edge, 2 cells and an office where Reed spent most of his working hours. Crowe sat in the larger cell, the only prisoner now that his gang had scattered and Reed's limited resources didn't permit extensive manhunts. He looked up when Henry entered, and the 2 men studied each other across the space between law-abiding citizen and captured criminal. Reed positioned himself by the door, giving them privacy but remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. Crowe spoke first, his voice quiet and without the edge of violence that had defined him earlier. He told Henry he was sorry about Duke, that watching the dog die had reminded Crowe his own hound lost decades ago, that he'd spent 25 years being angry about Jackson's death and hadn't brought the dog back or made the pain less. He said watching Henry and Duke had shown him something he'd forgotten, that love was worth the pain of loss, that the alternative was becoming so hard nothing could touch you, but nothing could matter either. Crowe said he was tired of being that person, tired of running from grief, tired of making the world pay for losses that were just part of living. Henry listened without interrupting, recognizing that Crowe needed to say these things more than Henry needed to hear them. When Crowe finished, Henry told him that Duke had been a gift, that 20 years ago when Henry had been forced to leave, Duke had represented everything good in his life that he was abandoning. Knowing Duke had suffered, had struggled, had spent years surviving alone contradicted the comfortable narrative Henry had constructed. But those final minutes, holding Duke and being recognized and loved despite everything, had somehow redeemed all of it. Crowe asked what Henry would do now, where he'd go with his past settled and his dog gone. Henry said he'd return to Colorado, to the ranch he managed and the identity he'd built over 20 years of honest work. He'd visit Duke's grave when he passed through Silver Point, which he intended to do regularly now that something important was buried here. He might get another dog eventually, though nothing could replace Duke, because living with the possibility of loss was better than living with the certainty of nothing matching. Crowe nodded understanding, and for a moment, the outlaw's face showed something that might have been envy at Henry's ability to choose hope despite everything. Vincent Crowe's trial happened 3 weeks later, drawing newspaper reporters from Denver and Cheyenne interested in the story of the legendary outlaw undone by a dog. The facts were straightforward. Multiple counts of bank robbery, kidnapping, and assault, with previous crimes spanning 2 decades adding to charges that carried mandatory execution. But the trial became less about legal outcomes and more about the story everyone wanted to hear, about Duke and Henry, and the reunion that had changed everything. The prosecutor argued that Crowe's decision to release hostages didn't erase his crimes, while the defense suggested it demonstrated capacity for redemption that deserved consideration. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, which surprised no one. What did surprise people was Judge Harrison Matthews' sentencing decision. Matthews was known for harsh justice, believing frontier law required strong deterrence against violence, but he'd sat through testimony about what happened in the bank and been affected by it. He sentenced Crowe to 20 years imprisonment instead of execution, citing the release of hostages and surrender as mitigating factors. It was controversial, with many arguing Crowe deserved death for his decades of crimes, but Matthews stood by his decision, saying that mercy given deserved mercy received. Crowe served his sentence at the Territorial Prison in Laramie, where he became known as a model prisoner who caused no trouble and helped younger inmates adjust confinement. He corresponded regularly with Henry, letters that began as brief acknowledgments and grew into genuine friendship between 2 men who'd found themselves on opposite sides of law, but shared understanding of loss and redemption. Henry visited twice a year, bringing news of the outside world and stories about the new dog he'd eventually adopted, a young shepherd he'd named Jackson in honor of Crowe's lost hound. The story of Duke and the bank robbery became legendary across Wyoming and beyond, told in saloons and around campfires, exaggerated and embellished until separating fact from fiction became impossible. Some versions had Duke leading a full cavalry charge to rescue Henry, Others claimed the dog had attacked the outlaws and driven them off single-handedly. But people who'd actually been there, who'd witnessed a reunion and the death and the transformation it caused, told a simpler truth, that an old dog's love had been strong enough to survive 20 years in impossible odds, and that witnessing it reminded everyone present of their own capacity for goodness. Dr. Sarah Chun placed a marker at Duke's grave, a simple stone that read, Duke, loyalty beyond measure, with dates that span an impossibly long life. The grave became a pilgrimage site for people traveling through Silver Point, particularly those who'd lost dogs and needed a place to honor that specific kind of grief. Henry maintained the site carefully during his regular visits, planting flowers and keeping the area clean, turning Duke's final resting place into something beautiful that celebrated the dog's life rather than just marking his death. Vincent Crowe was released after serving 15 years of his sentence, granted early parole for good behavior and age-related health concerns. He was 68, physically diminished but mentally sharp, and he chose to settle in Silver Point rather than disappear into anonymity elsewhere. He found work doing simple bookkeeping for local businesses, living quietly in a boarding house, and attending Duke's grave regularly with flowers and the kind of reverence usually reserved for human memorials. When asked why he stayed in the town where he'd been captured, he said it was where he'd learned to be human again, and leaving would dishonor that lesson. Henry continued managing his Colorado ranch until age and infirmity forced retirement, at which point he moved permanently to Silver Point to be near Duke's grave and the community that had formed around the story. He and Crowe became fixtures in town, two old men who lived extraordinary lives and found peace in ordinary routines. They'd sit together on the boarding house porch, drinking coffee and watching Silver Point's daily rhythms, occasionally speaking about the past, but mostly content with comfortable silence that didn't require words to communicate understanding. When Henry died at 76, his was specified burial next to Duke on a hill overlooking town. The funeral drew hundreds, including former hostages now middle-aged, children who'd grown up hearing the story, and strangers who'd been moved by the tale of impossible reunion and redemption. Crowe delivered a eulogy, his voice strong despite his 83 years, telling everyone that Henry had taught him that running from grief was slower death than facing it, that love was worth the pain of loss, and that sometimes the most important moment of life happened in the spaces between tragedy and grace. Vincent Crowe followed Henry 3 years later, his own death peaceful and attended by people who'd known him only as a quiet old man rather than the legendary outlaw he'd once been. His will requested burial on the same hill as Henry and Duke, slightly apart out of respect for their bond, but close enough to share the view. The request was granted, and the three graves form a triangle that told a complete story. A dog who never stopped searching, a man who never stopped grieving, and an outlaw who learned that mercy was stronger than revenge. The hill became officially recognized as Duke's Point, a landmark on territorial maps and a destination for people seeking to understand how small moments of connection could change entire lives. The town of Silver Point embraced the story as part of its identity, teaching children about loyalty and redemption through the tale of the bank robbery that ended without bloodshed because an old dog recognized his person after 20 years apart. Schools use the story to discuss themes of forgiveness, persistence, and the bonds between humans and animals that transcended rational explanation. Decades later, when Wyoming became a state and frontier stories began fading into history, Duke's Point remained maintained and visited, a physical reminder that love and loyalty could survive anything if given enough determination and a little impossible luck. The story continued to spread, adapted into books and plays, and eventually films that took liberties with facts but captured something essential about what had happened. Then, in the hardest moment, when violence seemed inevitable and grace seemed impossible, an old dog had walked into a bank and reminded everyone present that some things mattered more than money or survival or pride. If this story of incredible loyalty and unexpected redemption touched your heart, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel and join our community of people who believe in the power of love to transform even the darkest situations. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories from Frontier, where courage, compassion, and the bonds between humans and animals created moments that still inspire us today. Share your thoughts in the comments about Duke's remarkable journey and what it means to you, and let us know what other Frontier stories you'd like to hear. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful true tales to life, reminding us all that redemption is always possible and that sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest changes. Thank you for watching, and remember that loyalty once given can survive anything. We'll see you in the next story.